I'm Patti Carey, Vice President of Public Relations for Northcott, and I am a quilter. Today we're going to talk about making a Bargello quilt. I have some samples on the wall behind me here, so we're going to take a look at them and talk about what makes a Bargello. On this quilt here, you can see there is a flow of color, and that's what we're trying to create with a Bargello. It's actually a fairly simple quilt to make. We cut our fabric into strips, and then we cross-cut our strips into rings or segments of various widths to create the flow that you see happening in a Bargello quilt. This particular quilt here has 2 complete bands of color, and this is the project we'll be making today. I have a sample over here that is a smaller version, but also quite similar. 2 bands of color, though I have fewer fabrics in each band, and that's what this wall hanging is made up from. The sample over here has just 1 band of color, but it has 70 different fabrics in this quilt. So it's creating a larger wash of color in the quilt. Okay, let's get started. The collection that I'm going to be using is Serenity by Sherry Stroll. There are 2 different color combinations. The Spa colorway, which is soft and neutral, but the colorway that I'm going to be using is the Caribbean colorway, which has various shades of blue and turquoise, a little bit of green in it. There is a main pattern from the collection, and this is the focus fabric here. But this fabric won't work particularly well for the Bargello because the fabrics that you want to use in a Bargello would be ones that have an all-over texture, more like this fabric here, so that when you cut it up into small pieces, you are going to still be able to get the feel for the fabric. In a fabric like this, if I cut it into small pieces, I may end up with a dark section that has one of the shells in it, or a light section that has just the background, and that will change the look of the Bargello. So I know right now that this fabric will not be part of the Bargello, but it will make a great border fabric, so it's my focus fabric. I have the rest of the fabrics here, and they will all work fairly well for the Bargello. Some of them are more textural than others, other ones are busier, and the busy ones are nice because when the 2 patches come together, the defined edges are blurred, so these ones work really well. So the next step with my 12 fabrics that I have chosen for this quilt is that I'm going to put them into a grouping, an arrangement, so that I know how the color is going to flow in the quilt. So I'm going to start with this one here and see which fabrics play well. And let's see, I think I'm going to pick a blue one to go next. And I want to continue with this blue theme, trying to get lighter or darker colors. This one will take me into turquoise, a little bit more turquoise, and this one will take me into the green, too green at this point, so I'm going to leave that one out. This is a good one. Then this one, a medium value. This one a little lighter. Lighter still. Then my 2 remaining fabrics, I'm going to start going back to darker values. This fabric, your last fabric, will always be at some point next to the first fabric, so make sure that it goes in both positions. So now I have my fabrics arranged in the order that I would like them, so we're going to cut our strips now. The next step is cutting our strips to sew the Bargello. I have my fabric folded in half on my cutting mat here, and I am aligning it with the lines on my mat. I like to cut more than one layer of fabric at once. That way I can get to the quilting faster. So I am lining my second piece of fabric up directly on top of the first piece so that the folded edges are aligned. And the other thing that I like to do is keep my ruler on my fabric, and I use the lines on my mat to cut my strips. So the first strip that I'm going to cut, there's my even up part. For a larger Bargello, I like to cut my strips 2.5 inches wide, and that would be for bed size Bargello. For smaller projects, they can be smaller than that. A wall size, I would typically cut my strips 1.5 inches. So that would be 1.5 inches. They will finish at 1 inch, but for this particular quilt that I'm making, I'm going to cut them 2.5 inches. And I know that I need to cut 4 2.5 inch strips for this particular project. Because I'm putting the ruler on my fabric, I don't have to keep adjusting my fabric and re-straightening it after each cut. I simply move the ruler to the next 2.5 inch spot. There we go. I have my 4 strips of each of these 2 fabrics. I'll do the same with the other 10 fabrics in this quilt, and then we'll be ready to start sewing. Now we're going to start sewing the strips together. I've got my strips cut, and they are in the order that I would like to have the Bargello. So I'm going to take the first strip, lay it on my cutting surface, my sewing surface. I'm going to take the next strip and lay it face down, aligning that printed selvage end. I want to make sure that my strips, when I sew them together, are as straight as possible, and this is how I ensure that this happens. I put a pin at one end, at the center, and a pin at the other end. You can see here that the 2 strips are not aligned at the end, but that's fine. The strips are lying perfectly flat. I'm not pulling either one of them to make them fit. I'm just letting the fabric fall where it will. What I want to ensure is that this end is completely aligned. So I've got my second strip on top of my first strip. Now we're going to go to the sewing machine and sew. Okay, now we're ready to sew our strips together. I have 2 strips pinned together, and there's my printed selvage edge. Putting it in the machine. When we sew, it's not so much that we want our seam to be exactly 1/4 inch, but we want it to be consistent, and that will really show up in our Bargello. So I've got my 1/4 inch foot on the machine, and I am keeping my strip consistently lined up with the 1/4 inch. And stop before we get to the pins. Realign our strip. I know at the end my 2 strips do not line up, but that's fine. As long as I keep my cut edges aligned, I'm fine. This machine, the FAF, has a built-in walking foot. If you have a walking foot, this is a good time to use it. It keeps that strip set nice and straight. All right, our strips are sewn together, and now I'm going to show you a neat trick on how to press our seams to one side. Okay, I've got my strip set and I'm looking at it. My stitching line is nice and even with the edge of the fabric, so it's consistent. Now we're going to press our seams to one side. I have two tools that I like to use. The first one is a bamboo point turner, smooth on one side and rounded on the other. The other one that I can use is a clover Hera marker. And so I take my strip set. I know I want to press my seam towards my second strip. So I lightly finger press it. Now I'm going to take my tool and I am going to press along the edge of the seam. I am not pressing directly along, I am actually pushing up at an angle like that. So you can see that I'm pulling the fabric. But good quality fabric will not distort when you do this. And by pressing with the hair marker or the point presser, I am flattening that seam. Look how nice and flat that lays. Now it's easy for me to take my third strip and position it onto my second strip so that I can start sewing the next strip on. And again, I am keeping all of my strips with that printed selvage end aligned. I am not worrying about the other end, how it's aligned at the other end. So I will pin my strip together at the beginning, the midpoint, and again at the end. And I will sew this strip onto my strip set, and I will press my seam towards the second strip again. I will press my seams towards the even numbered strip sets. Okay, my strips are sewn together into the strip sets. So I have, for this particular quilt, I have 4 strip sets that will each have one of these 12 fabrics sewn together in this order. The next thing that I'm going to do is square up my strip set. I am checking to see that the strip set is straight, so I'm lining it up on one of the horizontal lines on my cutting mat to ensure that it's straight. If it is not straight, if it has decided to curve a bit as it approaches the end, I will take it to the iron and try and convince it to straighten out. But my strip set's pretty straight. So the next thing I'm going to do for each strip set is trim off the ends on a vertical line on my cutting mat. So I'm positioning the lines on my ruler along a vertical line on my mat, and I'm going to trim off that selvage edge so that what I have is perfectly vertically straight compared to the horizontally straight line that I'm working with here. Then I'm going to take my 2 strip sets and lay, because I need to make my Bargello long, I'm going to sew the 2 together, aligning those straight edges. And pin it in place. I'm going to sew this seam and I'm going to sew this seam to turn it into a tube, keeping these edges aligned. Okay, I've sewn my 2 strip sets together, and now I'm going to press the seams for those 2 seams I've just sewn in the same direction as the other seams in the quilt. So I know they need to get pressed towards, in my case, strip number 12, the even numbered strip. It's easier when you have a Bargello that has an even number, because you know when you're pressing towards the even numbered strips, you're always going to be having the right number of strips. And then I will take this to the ironing board and give it a good press on those 2 seams before we start cutting the strips, the tubes for the Bargello. All right, now we're ready to start cutting our Bargello into tubes so that we can create the Bargello pattern. I've folded my tube, so it's a full tube here. So it's on my cutting mat. I try and make sure that the seams from the bottom layer are not right in the same position as the seams on the top layer to reduce the bulk. And I'm aligning it on one of the horizontal lines on my cutting mat. If you're working with a larger quilt that is bigger than your cutting mat, such as a queen size, you can fold the tube into quarters. So have it as it is and then fold it in half again up on itself. My next step, according to following my pattern, is to cut my tube into rings of various widths. So the first thing I'm going to do is square up my tube. So I'm going to trim off the left edge so that I am working with something that is perfectly straight. Now, according to my chart, and this pattern will be posted online as a free download, it's Serenity Bargello. My first tube is going to be 2 inches wide. And the next step of the Bargello is I need to decide what fabric is going to arbitrarily be my fabric number 1, and I have chosen this fabric here. I am going to put a sticker telling me that this is the first tube. Open the seam at the top of fabric number 2. If this is fabric 1, the next one below it is fabric number 2. And I am going to open my Bargello right at that seam. I don't open it right now. I'm just going to position it here on my cutting mat so that I know that is my top patch of fabric. On tube number 2, I'm going to cut it to a width of 1 3/4 inches. And I'm going to take sticker number 2 for tube number 2, and I'm going to open the seam at the top of fabric number 3. 1, 2, 3. So my sticker goes there. I would open the seam there, and I'm going to position it next to tube number 1. What I'm really looking for here is that each fabric in tube number 2 is one position higher than it was in tube number 1. It's very easy to accidentally position the right fabric, but oh, none of the patches line up. The only one that lines up is that one. So we want to make sure when we put our sticker on that yes, it's directional. I want the number to be upright, and I want to make sure that not just that patch, but the one next to it is also one step higher or lower than it. The next tube that I'm cutting, tube number 3, is 1 1/2 inches. Sticker number 3 for tube number 3. Open seam at top of fabric number 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, refold, place it next to tube 2, and we are still having that flow of fabric, one fabric position up from the previous one. I'm going to continue along for the next few strips. Tube number 4 is 1 1/4 inches. Because these tubes are varying in widths, that is creating the spike or the flow in the Bargello. So tube 4, I'm opening at the top of fabric number 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it's still flowing. Number 5 is 1 inch. And I'm going to take sticker 5 and open at the seam of top of fabric number 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Strip 6, it's a narrow one, 3/4 of an inch. That's the narrowest that I want to use. When I do a queen size quilt, the narrowest that I go is 1/2 inch. It's proportional to the size of the quilt. I open seam at top of fabric 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And on strip numbers, tube number 7 is back to 1 inch. So it's a little wider than that previous strip. Sticker 7. Open seam at top of fabric number 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now watch what happens here. Can you see that my fabrics have peaked and now they're coming down? So every patch in tube number 7 is 1 position lower than it was in 6, whereas these ones were all 1 position higher. Now they're 1 position lower. So this narrowest strip is where my Bargello pattern is going to peak. You can have your Bargello peaking at a narrow point that is either higher or lower, or it can be a spot where it gets wider, that it's peaking and going to start curving the other way. Alright, so I've got some tubes cut here. I am going to open the seams at the top of all of these patches where the numbered sticker is, and I'm going to sew them together. Okay, now I'm going to sew my first open tube to my second open tube. So I'm going to take tube number 2 that I've opened at the top of the seam that was indicated on the instructions. I'm going to lay it face down on tube number 1. And you can see that my seams will naturally abut because all my seams have been pressed towards the even numbered tubes. So keeping my edges aligned, I'm going to sew the 2 opened tubes together. Keeping those seams butted where possible. Okay, so I have strip 2 sewn onto strip 1, and this is a really good test to see how accurate your seams were when you were sewing your strips together initially. On busier fabrics, they hide quite well if the seams do not intersect. I've sewn strip 2 to strip 1, and I'm going to finger press those seams to one side. Now I will continue adding strip 3, 4, 5, etc. until all of my strip sets, my tubes, my open tubes, have been added to the Bargello.